Okay, my original goal for this tutorial was to talk about IP classless versus no IP classless commands on the routers and their routing behaviors, as well as parent and child routes and the routing table. But I'm going to have to modify this tutorial a little bit because in Packet Tracer, the IP classless and the no IP classless commands are actually not available. So you're not going to be able to, I'm not going to be able to show you the classless versus the no IP classless or classful behavior of the router. Now, if you open up a router and you go to the command line interface and you look at the running configuration file, you'll see that by default the routers are already configured to run IP classless, so they're already functioning with classless routing behavior. Well, what does that mean? Okay, so in this network, you can see that over here, that these three networks have been subnetted. They were originally, let's say, the 192.168.1.0/24 network, and they've been subnetted into the 1.0/26 network, the 1.64 network/26, and the 1.128 network/26. Now, when you subnet a network, changing it from /24 to /26, you end up with 4 subnets: the 0 subnet, the 64 subnet, the 128 subnet, and the 192 subnet. But as you can see, I'm only using 3 of them. So there's a subnet that's not being used. It's the 192 subnet. Okay, so that's one thing. So we've got some subnetted networks here. Now, these networks should show up in this router's routing table as what we would call child routes, right? Child routes, or level 2 routes, level 2 child routes. All right. Now, the classful 192.168.1.0/24 is the parent route, or the level 1 route. So let's take a look at that right now. So we'll go in here and we'll do a show IP route, and you can see the routing table here, and we'll talk a little bit about this because it goes with Cisco CCNA curriculum. Here, for this one network that we have, this 193.168.1.0 network, you can see here there's the parent route. Notice the parent route, it says that it's subnetted. It tells you how it's been subnetted up here. It's going to be applied with a /26, and you can tell it's been subnetted into 3 subnets, but notice it doesn't resolve to an exit interface or a next hop IP address, right? So it's what we call, it's not an ultimate route. So this is a parent route, it's a level 1 route, but it is not an ultimate route. Okay. Now the children routes, the child routes, are indented, and they're right here. Okay, and you can see the child routes first of all have an indentation, right? And you can see that you've got the 0, the 64, the 128, and it says they're directly connected and they have an exit interface. So these are level 2 routes, child routes, and they're also ultimate routes because they have an exit interface. Okay, now this connected route on the 10 network is what we call a network route, and it has an exit interface. Now these routes are also have exit interface, they have a next hop IP address, so these are level 1 network routes, right? These 2 routes right here are level 1 network routes, and they're also ultimate routes. All right, and we don't have, it looks like we don't have a gateway of last resort. Let's make one. Okay, so we'll go in here and we'll say conft IP route 0.0.0.0 and 0.0.0.0, and we'll say to 10.0.0.2. Okay, so now we've set up a static route to the 0 network with a 0 subnet mask, and so this is a default route with a next hop address. So now if we look at our routing table, we also have a static route, right, to the 0 network with a 0 subnet mask. This is an ultimate route. It's a level 1 route, but it's also a default route. Okay, so now we have that. Now let's watch how now that we've talked about these different types of routes in the routing table, let's run a test. Okay, and this test has everything to do with IP classless and no IP classless. Now this router has IP classless configured by default, pre-configured on the router by default. And well, what does that mean? That means that the router, when it looks up its routes, and this is the example that I'm going to use, and that is, let's say we were to put this command into this computer host right here, and we said we want to ping 192.168.1.193. Okay, well, there is no 192 subnet. We talked about how there's a 0 subnet, 64 subnet, and a 128 subnet, but there's no 192 subnet, so there's no 193 host here. Now, with IP classless enabled on the router, which it is, what will happen is the router will look in its routing table, it will recognize the 192.168.1 classful prefix, and it will look for the 193, a match for the 193, which would be a 192 network, and it will look for it, /26, in its child routes. And it'll look through these child routes and it will not find a network. And with IP classless, what will happen is after it fails at finding the child route that matches with the 192.168.1, it will go back out of the routing table and eventually find the default route out. All right? So if we look at the routing table one more time, it'll look up the route, it'll recognize this, then it will look through these child routes, but it will not find the correct subnet or the correct child route. It'll then go out here and search here, and eventually it'll find this default route with a 0 subnet mask, meaning that 0 bits need to match. So it'll have a match and it will take the static default route and it will take a default route out of the network. Now this is because IP classless is enabled on the router. Now, if no IP classless was enabled on the router would look through these child routes, it would recognize the classful network, it would look through the subnets or the child routes, and if it doesn't find the correct subnet child route, it would just drop the packet. And that is the classful routing behavior, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But we can test this by taking this PC here and let's try to ping. We'll say, and I'm going to do this in simulation mode and speed it up a little bit. And we'll do this here. We'll say ping 192.168.1.193. And we already know that this does not exist on the network. So first of all, as you can see, the router is going to run ARP request because it doesn't have the gateway's MAC address in its ARP cache. So we'll get to see that too. So we'll play it. All right. Oh, and there goes the ARP. You can see here the color. So it's running an ARP request trying to resolve the MAC address from the IP addresses of the gateway. And it does that. And now it's sending a ping, right? And if we had no IP classless enabled on this router, the packet would get dropped right now. But it's not. It gets forwarded on the default route, and then this gets sent on the default route. The packet, even though there's no 193, it's forwarded on the default route. It's continued, the route is continued to look up in the routing table, right? So, and if we could turn off IP classless and issue a no IP classless command, what supposedly would happen is that ping would hit this router The router would not find the subnet and then would just drop the packet. Now, why is that? Well, possibly because in a classful network hierarchy, right, there are no discontiguous subnets. There's no VLSM, there's no CIDR if it's purely classful hierarchy. So if you were the owner of, let's say, the 192.168.1 network, there would be no other possibility of that subnet being anywhere else but on your network. So if your router couldn't find it, it might as well just drop it, because there are no discontiguous networks. There is no VLSM or CIDR in a classful hierarchy.